This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. G'day and kia ora. Welcome to an exploration of the unique bond between Australians and New Zealanders. Separated by the ditch, these Antipodean siblings share a history of sacrifice and a legendary love for taking the piss. From the Pavlova wars and linguistic quirks to the sporting scars and modern political friction, we'll dive into what makes this relationship so resilient. Join us as we discover how two nations can insult each other with such creativity, yet remain the ultimate best mates on the world stage. Chapter 1. Siblings in Arms, the Federation Divide. To understand the relationship between an Australian and a New Zealander, you first have to understand the geography of the Tasman Sea, or, as locals affectionately call it, the ditch. It is 2,000 kilometers of notoriously rough water that separates two nations so intertwined that they are often indistinguishable to anyone living north of the equator. To the rest of the world, they are the Antipodean twins, sharing a love for rugby, a similar-sounding accent, and a flag that is so nearly identical that politicians have occasionally stood in front of the wrong one during international summits. But to those who live there, the differences are as vast as the continent of Australia itself. This is a story of a bond that was forged in colonial boardrooms, tested on the battlefields of the First World War, and ultimately defined by a very polite but firm rejection of a shared political future. The shared history of these two nations begins long before the British arrived, but the paths their indigenous populations took could not have been more different. The ancestors of the Maori arrived in New Zealand, or Aotearoa, in several waves of waka from eastern Polynesia roughly between 1320 and 1350. They were master navigators who had conquered the Pacific using sophisticated astral methods and a deep understanding of the sea. By contrast, the history of indigenous Australians stretches back at least 40,000 to 65,000 years, making them part of the oldest continuous living culture on Earth. While the Maori, iwi were able to present a relatively unified population with a single language, the Australian Aboriginal populations consisted of hundreds of distinct groups with over 250 different languages and thousands of dialects. These two indigenous groups are not recorded to have ever met until the 17th and 18th centuries, when European exploration finally brought these two isolated worlds into the same orbit. When the British finally decided to plant a flag in the Southern Hemisphere, they didn't initially see Australia and New Zealand as two separate entities. In the eyes of the British Crown, New Zealand was effectively an extension of the colony of New South Wales. In fact, for a short period following the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, New Zealand was officially administered from Sydney. The European settlement of both regions dates back to the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788. But the flavor of that settlement created a lasting cultural divide that still fuels banter today. Australia was, famously, a penal colony, a place where Britain sent its convicts to carve a civilization out of what they perceived as a harsh, dry wilderness. New Zealand, on the other hand, was settled later and largely by free settlers. It was envisioned by figures like Edward Gibbon Wakefield as a middle-class English paradise, a religious and social getaway that would avoid the convict stain of its neighbor. This distinction is something New Zealanders have never quite let Australians forget. There is a long-standing joke that while Australians were founded by people the British didn't want, New Zealanders were founded by people the British simply couldn't keep. However, this narrative ignores the fact that some Australian colonies, like South Australia, were also founded as free settlements using the same Wakefieldian principles. During the 19th century, the borders were incredibly fluid. People, goods, and ideas flowed across the Tasman with ease. When gold was discovered in Otago in the 1860s, thousands of Australians rushed across the sea to try their luck, just as New Zealanders had flocked to the Victorian goldfields a decade earlier. At this point, the idea of a single, unified Australasia wasn't just a possibility, it was the expected outcome. As the 19th century drew to a close, the 6 Australian colonies began to talk seriously about uniting into a single federation. New Zealand was right there at the table. They participated in the Federal Council of Australasia from 1885 and were fully involved in the constitutional conventions of the 1890s. The Australian Constitution even includes a clause that explicitly leaves the door open for New Zealand to join as an Australian state at any time. Yet in 1901, when the Commonwealth of Australia was officially formed, New Zealand was conspicuously absent. They had looked at the proposal and essentially said, "No thanks, we're good." The reasons for this rejection were complex and reveal the early emergence of a distinct New Zealand identity. Distance was a major factor. In an era before air travel, the 1,200 miles of ocean between Wellington and Sydney felt like a significant barrier to effective governance. There was also a concern about the White Australia policy. New Zealand had already begun to weave Maori culture into its national identity in a way that Australia had not yet attempted with its indigenous population. New Zealanders feared that joining a federation dominated by the Australian colonies might jeopardize the status and rights of Maori citizens. There was also a touch of elitism. Many New Zealanders at the time felt they were culturally superior to the convict-descended Australians. A famous political cartoon from 1900 depicts Zealandia rejecting the chains of federation, viewing them as a restraint on her freedom rather than a path to progress. While they decided not to share a parliament, they soon found themselves sharing a trench. The defining moment of the Trans-Tasman relationship didn't happen in a courtroom or a capital city, but on the beaches of Gallipoli in 1915. During the First World War, the soldiers of both countries were formed into the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, giving birth to the acronym ANZAC. This was the blood bond. Both nations suffered horrific casualties in a campaign that was a strategic failure but a foundational success for their national psyches. For decades, Gallipoli was viewed as the moment both countries came of age as independent nations, finally stepping out from the shadow of the British Empire.
The Anzac spirit became a secular religion in both countries, commemorated every April 25th. It is a day where the rivalry is set aside and the shared sacrifice is honored. It's one of the few times you will see an Australian and a New Zealander stand together in total somber silence before they go back to arguing about who invented the Pavlova. This military cooperation wasn't a one-off event at Gallipoli either. The two nations had been fighting together since the mid-19th century. In 1834, British soldiers from Australia landed in New Zealand for the Harriet Affair, the first recorded clash between Maori and British troops. Later, during the New Zealand Wars of the 1860s, the Australian ship HMCS Victoria was dispatched to support the colonial government, and more than 2,500 Australians were recruited to fight in the Waikato. They have stood shoulder to shoulder in almost every major conflict since, from the Boer War and the World Wars to more recent peacekeeping missions in Timor-Leste and the Solomon Islands.
Despite this military brotherhood, the two countries began to drift onto different foreign policy trajectories after the Second World War. Both realized they could no longer rely solely on Britain for protection, especially after the fall of Singapore and the direct attacks on Australian soil by Japanese forces. This led to the 1951 ANZUS Pact with the United States. However, by the 1980s, New Zealand took a principled independence stance by declaring itself nuclear-free and banning U.S. nuclear-powered or nuclear-armed ships from its ports. This move effectively saw New Zealand suspended from the ANZUS alliance by the United States, while Australia remained a staunch and committed American ally. This divergence highlighted a fundamental difference in their national characters. Australia often seeks security through powerful alliances, while New Zealand is more willing to go it alone on the international stage, prioritizing its principles over traditional security umbrellas. This independence is a point of pride for New Zealanders, who often view Australians as being a bit too eager to follow the lead of major powers like the US or the UK. Conversely, some Australian politicians have historically viewed New Zealand as freeloading on regional security, essentially benefiting from Australia's massive defense spending while taking a moral high ground that is easier to maintain when you have a larger neighbor acting as a buffer. These tensions occasionally boil over into public spatting, such as when Australian ministers suggest that New Zealand should be more grateful for the heavy lifting Australia does in the region. The socio-economic landscape also reveals a fascinating asymmetry. Since 1973, the Trans-Tasman travel arrangement has allowed citizens of both countries to live and work in the other indefinitely. This has led to a massive migration flow, but it is almost entirely one way. There are currently around 670,000 New Zealanders living in Australia, roughly 15% of the entire New Zealand population. In contrast, only about 70,000 Australians live in New Zealand. Australia is the land of opportunity, the lucky country, where wages are higher and the sun is brighter. For many Kiwis, moving to Australia is a rite of passage, a way to seek a bigger stage and a fatter paycheck. However, this brain drain is a source of constant anxiety in New Zealand. This has created a dynamic where New Zealanders are hyper-aware of everything Australia does, while Australians often forget New Zealand exists until a rugby match is scheduled or a major disaster strikes. A 2016 study showed that a third of Australians didn't even name New Zealand as a regional neighbor. This lack of attention can be infuriating for New Zealanders, who often feel their contributions and distinct national identity are overlooked by their larger neighbor.
Even the way the two nations view their indigenous heritage has created a point of contrast. New Zealand's national identity is profoundly shaped by Maori culture. It is integrated into government policy, the education system, and daily social expressions. The Treaty of Waitangi is viewed as the nation's founding document, providing a framework for reconciliation and representation that has given Maori a significant political voice since the 19th century. In Australia, the path has been much more fraught. Lacking a similar treaty during colonization, Australia operated under the legal fiction of terra nullius, nobody's land, until 1992. While there is deep respect for the incredible diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, their integration into the national narrative has been less uniform and remains a central, often divisive theme in Australian politics. New Zealanders often look across the ditch with a sense of forward-thinking superiority on this issue, while Australians point to the sheer complexity and scale of their own Indigenous history as a different challenge entirely. As we look at these two nations today, we see a relationship that is best described as a deep and enduring friendship. They are best mates who know exactly which buttons to press to annoy each other. They share a common heritage, a common language, and a common worldview, yet they have spent the last 120 years carefully carving out distinct identities. Australia is the bold, brash continental power with a multicultural urban dynamism and a global economic reach. New Zealand is the intimate, principled island nation with a bicultural heart and a reputation for punching well above its weight in diplomacy and social policy. They are bound by the Anzac legend, a shared legal system, and a freedom of movement that is almost unique in the modern world. They are the only two countries that can insult each other with such venomous creativity and then immediately turn around and defend each other against any outsider who dares to join in. It is a bond born of blood on the cliffs of Gallipoli and a very polite no thanks in the colonial offices of the 1890s. But as the world changes and new geopolitical pressures emerge, can this trans-Tasman bond survive the growing pains of modern diplomacy and the shifting tides of the Pacific? Chapter 2.
the South Pacific Voltron and the Handshake insult. If you want to measure the temperature of the relationship between an Australian and a New Zealander, you don't look at the climate or the trade balance, you look at the feelings thermometer. This is an actual metric used by the Lowy Institute, a Sydney-based think tank that polls Australians on how warm they feel toward other countries on a scale of 0 to 100 degrees. Year after year, New Zealand consistently tops the list, recently clocking in at a toasty 84 degrees. It is the highest rating any country has ever received in the history of the poll. On the other side of the ditch, the sentiment is mirrored. Over 90% of New Zealanders identify Australia as a friend. By every statistical measure, these two nations are the ultimate best mates of the Asia-Pacific. But if you were to walk into a pub where an Australian and a New Zealander are having a drink, toasty warmth might be the last thing you'd observe. Instead, you'd likely hear a barrage of insults that would make a sailor blush. To an outsider, particularly an American or a European, it might look like the brink of a diplomatic incident. To the locals, however, this is simply the highest form of affection. In the Trans-Tasman lexicon, an insult is often a handshake, and a joke at the other's expense is a sign of deep-seated trust.
This insult as affection theme is perfectly captured in the way New Zealanders refer to their massive neighbor. In a display of cheeky geographical revisionism, Kiwis often refer to Australia as the West Island. The joke implies that Australia isn't a sovereign continent, but merely a larger, slightly more desert-filled province of New Zealand. It is a linguistic way of taking the larger neighbor down a peg. Australians, for their part, give as good as they get, often firing back with jokes about New Zealand being a giant sheep station that the rest of the world forgot to put on the map. Perhaps the most famous handshake insult in history came from New Zealand Prime Minister Robert Muldoon. When asked about the increasing number of New Zealanders migrating across the ditch to find work, he quipped that the exodus raised the average IQ of both countries. It remains the quintessential example of the South Pacific wit, a joke that manages to insult the intelligence of both nations simultaneously while acknowledging their inseparable connection. There is a legendary story that encapsulates this peculiar dynamic, often shared among military circles. It involves a group of Australian troopers and New Zealander infantrymen drinking together in a bar after a combined military exercise. The air was blue with profanity. The Australians were calling the Kiwis sheepshaggers, and the New Zealanders were firing back with comments about the Australians being thieving convict pricks. Seeing this apparent hostility, a group of American Marines who were also in the bar decided to join in. They figured they'd help their Australian allies out by making a few disparaging comments about New Zealand being a small, insignificant country.
What happened next is what locals call the South Pacific Voltron effect. Without a single word of coordination, every Australian and New Zealander in the room stopped insulting each other. They turned as one unified, menacing force and faced the Americans. The men who had been yelling in each other's faces seconds ago were now standing shoulder to shoulder, advancing on the confused Marines with palpable menace. The Marines, realizing they had made a grave tactical error by trying to bully a family member, wisely retreated. As soon as the outsiders were gone, the Australians and New Zealanders went right back to their drinks, arm in arm, laughing together for the rest of the night. This is the fundamental rule of the Trans-Tasman bond. We can say whatever we want about each other, but the second someone else tries it, they've got a fight on their hands. This protective instinct is rooted in a shared cultural reflex that binds them tighter than almost any other two nations on Earth, a deep-seated suspicion of the tall poppy. In both Australia and New Zealand, there is a cultural instinct to cut down anyone who gets too big for their boots or starts acting like they're better than everyone else. Arrogance is the ultimate sin. This egalitarian streak means that a billionaire and a plumber can sit at the same bar and have a conversation as equals. And if either one starts showing off, the other will be the first to pull them back down to earth with a well-placed barb. This shared tall poppy syndrome is why their humor is so similar. Both cultures prize self-deprecation and a dry, cynical wit that finds the absurdity in almost any situation. It's a way of keeping the world and each other honest. However, the economic disparity between the two nations still creates moments of friction. Because Australia's economy is so much larger and its wages higher, it acts as a giant vacuum for New Zealand talent. This isn't just a matter of young professionals moving to Sydney for a few years. It has fundamentally altered the demographics of the region. Most notably, a significant portion of the Maori population now lives in Australia. This massive diaspora has built vibrant communities in places like the Gold Coast and Western Australia, where you are as likely to hear a Maori greeting as you are an Australian g'day. The reality of this mass migration has led to the rise of advocacy groups like Kiwi, which lobbies for the rights of New Zealanders living across the ditch. For years, many of these migrants lived in a state of permanent temporariness, paying taxes into a system that didn't always offer them a safety net in return. This political friction grounds the sibling jokes in a more serious reality. It's one thing to laugh about sheep and convicts, it's another to navigate the complexities of being a non-protected resident in your best friend's house. This shared sense of humor and rivalry is often a bridge that outsiders struggle to cross. A New Zealander might move to Brisbane and find that their Australian co-workers are constantly taking the piss out of them. To someone from a more formal culture, this might look like workplace bullying. To the Australian, it's a test of character. If the New Zealander can fire back with a clever insult of their own and not take themselves too seriously, they are immediately accepted into the fold. It's a culture where calling someone a mate can sometimes be a warning, but calling them a bastard is often a term of endearment. This toasty friendship is resilient because it's built on more than just trade deals. It's built on a shared DNA of mateship. Whether it's helping each other out during bushfires and earthquakes, or standing together in a bar fight against an interloper, the bond is reflexive. It's a relationship where the insults are thick, the rivalry is fierce, and the competition is relentless. But the loyalty is absolute. They are the only two people in the world who truly understand each other's jokes, and they are the only two who are allowed to tell them. As the world becomes more complex and the geopolitical tides of the Pacific continue to shift, this unique bond remains a rare constant. But even as they stand together as a South Pacific Voltron against the rest of the world, there is one area where the two nations will never see eye to eye. It is a divide that goes deeper than politics or economics, right to the very way they perceive the world around them. How can two people who share so much history and so much culture manage to sound so profoundly different the moment they open their mouths to order a meal? Chapter 3. Six or Sex? The Trans-Tasman Tongue. If you ever want to see an Australian and a New Zealander immediately stop whatever they are doing and engage in a high-stakes linguistic debate, all you have to do is ask them to order a side of fried potatoes at a local snack bar. To an American or a Brit, the ensuing exchange might sound like two people speaking the exact same dialect of English. But to the locals, it is the ultimate phonetic faux pas. The New Zealander will ask for fush and chups, while the Australian will counter with feesh and cheeps. This isn't just a minor difference in pronunciation, it is the front line of a phonetic war that has been raging across the Tasman Sea for over a century. It is the moment where the toasty friendship hits a speed bump of vowels, and it reveals more about their mutual perceptions than almost any other cultural marker. To the untrained ear, the accents are often lumped together under the broad category of Antipodean. But for those living in the region, the distinction is sharp and often used as a tool for playful mockery. Linguists have spent decades trying to figure out why two nations with such similar colonial origins ended up sounding so different. One school of thought is the single origin theory, which suggests that because both countries were settled by similar groups of British and Irish immigrants, they started with the same linguistic base. The mixing bowl theory, however, argues that the accents evolved as a unique blend of the specific dialects brought by those early settlers, further shaped by isolation and local adaptation. Whatever the cause, the result is a phonetic divide that is as wide as the 2,000 kilometers of water between them. The most famous point of contention is the vowel shift. New Zealanders are notorious for what linguists call centralizing their vowels. In simpler terms, they tend to move their I sounds toward a U or a schwa sound. This is why fish becomes fush and six becomes sucks. This particular quirk has led to one of the most endearing jokes in the relationship, usually told by Australians, the sex versus six confusion. An Australian might ask a New Zealander for the time, and if it's 6 o'clock, the Kiwi's response can lead to a very different conversation than intended. There's a classic joke about a New Zealander who wants to talk about his new outdoor deck in the backyard, but because of his accent, his Australian neighbors are left snickering at what sounds like a very inappropriate boast. New Zealanders, in turn, mock the Australian nasal twang, particularly the way they stretch out the E sound. To a Kiwi, an Australian saying Sydney sounds like Seedney, and the word no becomes a multisyllabic journey that sounds more like na-oo. But the divide goes much deeper than just how they say their words. It's about the words themselves. The Trans-Tasman lexicon is a minefield of naming conventions that can lead to genuine confusion for a traveler. Take, for instance, the most basic piece of summer equipment, the portable cooler. In Australia, this is an esky, a brand name that has become the universal term for a plastic box filled with ice and beer. Cross the ditch to New Zealand, and you are suddenly looking for a chili bin. If you ask for an esky in Auckland, you might get a blank stare. If you ask for a chili bin in Sydney, you'll likely be told to speak English, mate.
The same applies to footwear. The humble flip-flop is a staple of life in both countries, given their shared love for the beach. But in Australia, they are thongs. This is a term that causes endless amusement for Americans, who associate the word with a specific type of undergarment. New Zealanders, perhaps sensing the potential for confusion, opted for jandals. The word is a portmanteau of Japanese sandals, reflecting the origin of the design that became popular in the mid-20th century. To a New Zealander, calling them thongs sounds archaic or slightly risque. To an Australian, calling them jandals sounds like something out of a 1950s catalog. Even the way they describe their outdoor adventures reveals a subtle difference in national character. In Australia, if you go for a long walk in the wilderness, you are bushwalking. It is a term that feels rugged and continental, evoking the vast dry expanses of the outback. In New Zealand, you are tramping. To an Australian, tramping sounds like something a vagrant does. To a Kiwi, it is a noble pursuit involving heavy boots, raincoats, and steep mountain paths. This linguistic choice reflects the terrain. Australians walk through the scrub, while New Zealanders tramp through the mud and over the Southern Alps.
One of the most profound differences in the way the two nations use English is the integration of indigenous language. In New Zealand, Te Reo Maori is an official language, and its influence on everyday New Zealand English is significant and growing. It is completely normal for a news broadcast in New Zealand to begin with the greeting Kia ora, or for a government department to be referred to by its Maori name. Words like whānau, family, kai, food, and hikoi, a protest march, are part of the common vernacular for New Zealanders of all backgrounds. This integration is a point of national pride and a key part of the bicultural identity that New Zealanders use to distinguish themselves from Australians. In Australia, the linguistic landscape is very different. Because there are over 250 distinct Aboriginal languages and thousands of dialects, there is no single indigenous word that has achieved the same level of universal, everyday use as Kia ora. While Aboriginal place names like Wagga Wagga or Wollongong are ubiquitous, and words like kangaroo and boomerang have entered the global lexicon, the use of Indigenous greetings or phrases in daily Australian English is much less common. This often leads to a perception among New Zealanders that Australia is behind the times in its Indigenous relations, while Australians point to the sheer linguistic diversity of their continent as a barrier to the kind of unified integration seen in New Zealand. The Australian penchant for abbreviation is another major differentiator. Australians are famous for their strine slang, which involves a relentless drive to shorten every possible word and add an O or an IE to the end. Breakfast becomes brekkie. Afternoon becomes arvo. A barbecue is a barbie, and McDonald's is universally known as Macca's. Even names aren't safe. If your name is Barry, you are Baza. If it's Sharon, you are Shaza. This linguistic habit reflects a culture that values informality and a lack of pretense. It's a way of signaling that you are part of the group, a mate who doesn't need to use fancy multisyllabic words. New Zealanders use abbreviations too, but not with the same aggressive frequency or creative flair as Australians. A Kiwi might say brekkie, but they are less likely to refer to their vocab as their vocabulary in a professional setting. Instead, New Zealanders often use we to describe anything small, a linguistic remnant of their strong Scottish heritage, particularly in the South Island. A Kiwi might offer you a wee bit of cake or tell you they'll be back in a wee moment. To an Australian, this sounds quaint and slightly British. To a New Zealander, the Australian habit of shortening everything can sometimes come across as lazy or overly colloquial. The naming of everyday commercial spaces also creates a divide. In Australia, the small corner shop where you buy milk, bread, and the newspaper is often called a milk bar, though this term is fading in favor of convenience store. In New Zealand, this is a dairy. It is a word that confuses Australians, who associate it with a farm or a place where cheese is made. For a Kiwi, going to the dairy is a fundamental part of childhood. It's where you get your lolly scrambles and your ice creams. Similarly, if you are looking for a holiday home by the beach, an Australian might call it a shack, a beach house, or a weekender. A New Zealander has a specific sacred word for this, a bach, pronounced like batch. In the South Island, it's often called a crib. These words are loaded with cultural meaning, evoking a specific type of modest, relaxed lifestyle that is central to the New Zealand identity. Even the way they refer to each other's countries can be a source of irritation. New Zealanders frequently refer to Australia as Aussie. They might say, "I'm heading over to Aussie for a few weeks." To an Australian, this is jarring. In Australian English, Aussie is a person, never a place. You are an Aussie, but you live in Australia. For a Kiwi, to use the word as a noun for the country sounds to an Australian ear like someone saying they are going to American instead of America. Conversely, Australians often refer to New Zealanders as Kiwis, a term that New Zealanders have embraced with such vigor that it has become their unofficial national demonym. While Aussie can sometimes be used with a touch of irony or self-deprecation in Australia, Kiwi is almost always a badge of honor in New Zealand, used to describe everything from their sports teams to their innovative can-do attitude. The household is another place where the lexicon divide is apparent. If you are getting ready for bed in an Australian house, you will pull up your doona. This is a word that is virtually unknown in New Zealand, where the same item is called a duvet. If you ask for a doona in Wellington, you might be asked if that's a type of pastry. The origins of doona are actually Scandinavian, brought to Australia by a specific brand in the 1970s, but it has become so deeply embedded in the Australian language that most Aussies are shocked to find it isn't used elsewhere. Similarly, if you are at a playground, an Australian child will go down a slippery dip, while a New Zealand child will simply use a slide. To a Kiwi, slippery dip sounds like an overly descriptive and slightly childish term. To an Aussie, slide feels a bit too plain. These differences extend even to the mundane world of road safety and stationery. An Australian driver sees witches' hats on the road during construction. A New Zealander sees road cones. An Australian office worker uses sticky tape to mend a document. A New Zealander uses sellotape. If you make a mistake on a paper in Australia, you use whiteout. In New Zealand, you use twink, another brand name that has become a generic term. These small everyday differences act as constant reminders that while they are mates, they are not the same. The way they address each other also carries a different weight. The word mate is the cornerstone of the Australian social contract. It is a term of equality, a way of signaling that we are all on the same level. However, mate in Australia is a versatile tool. It can be a warm greeting, but with a slight change in tone, it can be a sharp warning. If an Australian starts a sentence with a slow, drawn-out "mate," you know you're in trouble. In New Zealand, mate is used, but it often competes with bro or cuz. These terms, influenced by Maori and Pacifica culture, reflect a more familial, community-oriented style of address. While an Australian might call a stranger mate to establish an instant informal bond, a New Zealander might use bro to signal a sense of shared belonging and relaxed kinship. This linguistic rivalry is most visible when the two nations are forced to cooperate. In a workplace where Australians and New Zealanders are mixed, the banter over terminology is constant. It's a way of asserting national identity in a sea of similarity. A New Zealander will go out of their way to say chili bin just to see the Australian roll their eyes. And an Australian will double down on arvo and brekkie just to emphasize their own strine credentials. It's a performative language, a way of saying, I might live in your city and do your job, but I still sound like home. But beneath the jokes and the phonetic mockery, there is a genuine respect for the nuances of each other's speech. Both nations are intensely proud of their unique versions of English, viewing them as a successful adaptation of a colonial language to a new Southern Hemisphere reality. They are non-rotetic cultures, meaning they both drop the R at the end of words like car or butter, a shared trait that separates them from the rotetic Americans and Canadians. This non-roticity is a lingering tie to their British roots, even as they have both spent the last century drifting further and further away from the King's English. The great Trans-Tasman lexicon divide is ultimately a sign of health in the relationship. It shows that despite the massive economic and cultural pressure from Australia, New Zealand has maintained a distinct, vibrant, and resilient voice. And despite Australia's size and global reach, it has kept a colloquial, informal language that remains stubbornly resistant to being sanitized by global English. They might argue over vowels and they might laugh at each other's names for flip-flops and coolers, but they are the only two people in the world who can truly navigate this linguistic minefield with ease. This phonetic and lexical friction is just one layer of the complex rivalry that defines the sibling bond. It sets the stage for even more intense debates that move from the tongue to the table and the playing field. Because if they can't agree on how to say fish and chips, how on earth can they agree on who actually invented the food they are eating or who deserves to hold the trophy at the end of a grueling 90-minute match? As we move from the sounds of their voices to the scars of their shared history, the question remains, is this linguistic divide just the tip of an iceberg that hides even deeper, more competitive tensions? Chapter 4: Pavlova Wars and Sporting Scars. If you want to see the toasty warmth of the Trans-Tasman relationship drop to sub-zero temperatures in a matter of seconds, you don't need to bring up geopolitics or economic policy. You just need to walk into a crowded room and ask one simple, innocent-sounding question. So, who actually invented the Pavlova? In that moment, the shared history and mutual respect of these two nations evaporate, replaced by a fierce, protective brand of culinary nationalism. To an outsider, it is a debate about a meringue-based dessert topped with cream and fruit. To an Australian or a New Zealander, it is a fight for the very soul of their national identity. This is the Culinary Cold War, a decades-long dispute where every recipe book is a manifesto and every bakery is a front line. The Pavlova is named after the Russian ballerina Anna Pavlova, who toured both Australia and New Zealand in the 1920s. Both nations claim to have created the dessert in her honor, but the evidence is a source of constant friction. Australians will point to a recipe from 1935 attributed to a chef in Perth, while New Zealanders will smugly direct you to a display in the small town of Otorohanga that provides a much lengthier, more detailed explanation for why the dessert was actually born on Kiwi soil as early as 1926. This isn't just about who whipped the egg whites first, it's about a broader pattern of what New Zealanders see as Australian theft. Because Australia is the larger market with a louder global voice, it has a habit of absorbing New Zealand's successes and presenting them to the world as its own. Whether it's Lamingtons, the flat white coffee, or the iconic Anzac biscuit, the battle over the pantry is a constant reminder of the friction between the two neighbors.
The Anzac biscuit is perhaps the most emotionally charged of these shared items. Unlike the Pavlova, which is a celebration of sugary lightness, the Anzac biscuit is a symbol of shared grit and wartime sacrifice. Made of rolled oats, sugar, flour, butter, and golden syrup, these biscuits were designed to survive the long journey to the soldiers fighting in the trenches of the First World War. Today, they are legally protected in both countries. You cannot even call them Anzac cookies without risking a fine from the Department of Veterans Affairs. While the recipe is identical on both sides of the Tasman, the biscuits serve as a culinary tether to the Anzac spirit, a reminder that while they may argue over who gets the credit, the foundation of their culture was baked in the same oven of imperial struggle. Then there is the flat white. In recent years, as coffee culture has gone global, the fight over who invented this specific microfoam masterpiece has intensified. Wellington claims it was a happy accident in a local cafe in the late 1980s, while baristas in Sydney and Melbourne insist they were perfecting the art years earlier. To a New Zealander, seeing a flat white on a menu in London or New York labeled as an Australian classic is a minor tragedy. It reinforces the feeling that no matter how much they innovate, the neighbor across the ditch will eventually put their own name on the trophy. But if the culinary Cold War is fought with cookbooks and snide remarks at dinner parties, the sporting rivalry is fought with actual blood, sweat, and the occasional diplomatic incident. In the Southern Hemisphere, sport isn't just a pastime, it is the primary way these two nations measure their worth against each other. The rivalry is so intense that it often spills over into the political arena. Nowhere was this more evident than on a humid afternoon at the Melbourne Cricket Ground on February 1, 1981. This was the day of the infamous Underarm Bowl, a moment that remains a jagged scar in the Trans-Tasman psyche. The rivalry was a classic cricket nail-biter. It was the final ball of a one-day international match. New Zealand needed a 6 to tie the game. In a move that was technically legal under the rules of the time, but viewed as a massive violation of the spirit of the game, Australian captain Greg Chappell instructed his brother, Trevor, to bowl the ball underarm along the ground. This made it physically impossible for the New Zealand batsman, Brian McKechnie, to hit the ball for a 6. McKechnie blocked the ball and then threw his bat away in a gesture of pure disgusted frustration. The fallout was immediate and explosive. In New Zealand, the reaction was one of national outrage. Then Prime Minister Robert Muldoon didn't hold back, famously declaring it the most disgusting incident I can recall in the history of cricket, and adding that it was an act of true cowardice and fitting that the Australian team were wearing yellow. In Australia, the reaction was more mixed, but many fans were genuinely embarrassed by the lack of fair play. For New Zealanders, the underarm bowl became the ultimate proof of the Australian character, that they would do anything, even cheat the spirit of the game, just to avoid losing to their neighbor.
It transformed the rivalry from a friendly competition into something much sharper. To this day, a New Zealander only has to mention the word underarm to an Australian to instantly win any argument about sporting integrity. This sense of win at all costs is something Kiwis often contrast with their own self-image of being the humble, quiet achievers. But don't let the modesty fool you. When it comes to rugby union, the New Zealanders are anything but quiet. Rugby is the national religion of New Zealand, and the All Blacks are its high priests. For a country to consistently dominate a global sport is a source of immense national pride, and their favorite victim is almost always the Australian Wallabies. The Bledisloe Cup, the annual trophy contested between the two nations, has spent so much time in New Zealand over the last 2 decades that many young Australians have never actually seen their own team hold it. The All Blacks' pre-game ritual, the haka, is a vibrant symbol of this sporting dominance. While it is a Maori ceremonial challenge rooted in deep indigenous tradition, in the context of a rugby match, it is also a psychological weapon. For Australians, watching the haka is a complex experience. There is a deep, genuine respect for the culture it represents, but there is also the practical reality of having 15 massive men screaming a warrior challenge at you before the whistle even blows. Over the years, the Wallabies have tried various ways to respond to the haka, standing close, ignoring it, or even advancing toward the Kiwis. But the all-black aura often feels insurmountable. In New Zealand, a victory over Australia in rugby isn't just a win, it is a reaffirmation of their place in the world. The intensity of this rivalry isn't limited to the men's field. The netball rivalry between the Australian Diamonds and the New Zealand Silver Ferns is arguably even more fierce. These matches are frequently described in the media as bloody and brutal. In 2003, the tension reached a boiling point when the Australian coach was quoted calling the New Zealand team a bunch of scrubbers. This was a specific, biting insult that resonated across the Tasman, leading to a series of matches that were played with a level of physicality that shocked even seasoned sports commentators. In netball, as in rugby, the two nations have a long history of being the top 2 in the world, meaning every match is effectively a battle for global supremacy. This relentless competition is reflected in the way the two populations view their respective national athletes. When a New Zealander is successful on the global stage, Australians are quick to adopt them. This led to the claiming of icons like the legendary racehorse Fairlap. Born in New Zealand but achieving his greatest fame in Australia, Fairlap's heart is kept in a jar at the National Museum of Australia in Canberra, while his skeleton is in the Te Papa Museum in Wellington. It is the ultimate divided custody arrangement. New Zealanders view this as another example of Australian cultural poaching, while Australians view it as a natural result of their larger economy providing the stage for Kiwi talent to shine. The asymmetry of the relationship means that the sporting scars often run deeper in New Zealand. An Australian might be annoyed by a loss to the All Blacks, but they have other sports to fall back on: AFL, cricket, swimming, or soccer. For a New Zealander, a loss to Australia in rugby or netball can feel like a national day of mourning. This is why the wins are celebrated with such unbridled joy. It is the moment where the underdog finally gets to stand over the favorite and gloat, a reversal of the economic and demographic reality that usually defines their lives. Even the way they watch sports together reflects the toasty yet combative friendship. An Australian and a New Zealander sitting at a bar watching a match will trade banter that would sound like genuine hostility to an outsider. They will mock each other's accents, bring up the underarm bowl, and argue over who truly invented the meat pie. But the moment the game is over, they are usually back to being mates, buying each other around and complaining about the referee. The rivalry is a release valve for the tensions of their close proximity. It allows them to express their differences in a controlled, ritualized environment, ensuring that the South Pacific Voltron can still form when an external threat appears. As we look at these two nations today, we see that the culinary Cold War and the sporting scars are essential to the relationship. They provide the flavor of the Trans-Tasman bond. Without the fight over the Pavlova or the memory of the underarm bowl, the relationship might be too bland, too much like a standard diplomatic partnership. These rivalries keep the connection alive and personal. They ensure that even as the two economies become more integrated and their defense forces work more closely together, they never lose sight of who they are as individuals. But while they are busy arguing over who makes the best mince pie or who deserves the Bledisloe Cup, a more serious set of challenges is emerging. The toasty friendship is being tested by new political realities that go far beyond the boundary rope of a cricket pitch. As Australia adopts increasingly tough policies on immigration and deportation, and New Zealand finds itself grappling with the growing pains of a modern, independent foreign policy, the question is no longer just about who invented a dessert. It is about whether the old bonds of mateship and the shared Anzac legend are enough to hold them together in an increasingly uncertain world. How does the relationship survive when the teasing turns into genuine political resentment, and New Zealanders start to feel that Australia isn't just a bully on the cricket field, but a threat to their own citizens' rights? Chapter 5. Little Siblings. While Australians and New Zealanders are happy to spend decades bickering over the origin of a meringue dessert or the fairness of an underarm delivery on the cricket pitch, there is a point where the sibling ribbing stops and the diplomatic gloves come off. In recent years, the relationship has moved into a space of genuine political friction. This shift is often defined by what researchers call the asymmetry of the relationship. To put it bluntly, Australia is the massive continental power with 26 million people and a global economic footprint, while New Zealand is the intimate island nation of 5 million, often feeling like the junior partner in a firm where the senior partner keeps forgetting to invite them to the board meetings. This asymmetry has birthed a modern version of the little sibling syndrome, where New Zealand's desire for a principled, independent identity, clashing with Australia's Fortress Australia mentality, has created some very real growing pains.
Nowhere is this friction more visible than in the controversial Section 501 deportations. In 2014, the Australian government amended its Migration Act, essentially toughening the character test for non-citizens. Under these rules, the Australian Minister for Home Affairs gained the power to cancel the visas of anyone sentenced to 12 months or more in prison. On the surface, it sounds like a standard law and order policy. But for New Zealand, it felt like a targeted strike against the bonds of mateship. Since 2015, over 1,300 New Zealanders have been deported from Australia, making them the most deported nationality in the country. The sting lies in the details. Many of these people had lived in Australia since they were toddlers. They had Australian accents, Australian families, and Australian jobs. Yet they were being sent back to a country they barely remembered because they had tripped up on the wrong side of the law. The political rhetoric surrounding this has been anything but sibling-like. New Zealand's Justice Minister, Andrew Little, famously described the policy as having a venal political strain, asserting that it made Australia look less like a best friend and more like a distant, uncaring neighbor. The tension reached a boiling point when a 17-year-old New Zealander was held in a Melbourne adult detention facility for months, prompting then Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern to use the word corrosive to describe the policy's impact on the Trans-Tasman bond. From the New Zealand perspective, Australia was essentially exporting its trash, taking people who were culturally Australian and dumping the responsibility for their rehabilitation onto New Zealand taxpayers. The Australian rebuttal, often led by figures like Peter Dutton, was characteristically blunt. The Australian government argued that their primary responsibility was the safety of their own citizens.
In one particularly sharp exchange, Dutton reminded New Zealand that Australia does a lot for its smaller neighbour, even hinting that without Australia's tough border policies, New Zealand might find itself facing boatloads of unauthorised migrants. This highlights the fundamental power imbalance. Australia knows it is the regional heavyweight, and it isn't afraid to remind New Zealand that the big sibling is the one providing the security umbrella for the whole family. This sense of being a second-class citizen in the big sibling's house was further fueled by the 2001 immigration changes. For over 20 years, New Zealanders moving to Australia were placed on a special category visa. While this allowed them to live and work indefinitely, it stripped away their pathway to citizenship and denied them access to the social safety net. Kiwis who had lived in Australia for decades, paying taxes the whole time, found themselves ineligible for student loans, disability support, or even emergency help during the pandemic. In contrast, an Australian moving to New Zealand is treated as a permanent resident from day one, with a clear path to citizenship and full access to benefits after a short waiting period. This lack of reciprocity was a constant source of bitterness, leading to the 2016 Australia Today report, which found that New Zealanders were the second most unhappy migrant group in Australia, trailing only behind asylum seekers. However, the tide began to turn in July 2023 when Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced a new direct pathway to citizenship for New Zealanders. This was a massive diplomatic win for New Zealand, finally addressing the limbo that hundreds of thousands of Kiwis had lived in for 2 decades. By August 2023, over 15,000 New Zealanders had already applied, signaling a desperate desire to finally belong in the country they called home. Yet, even as this domestic irritant was being soothed, a deeper cultural divide was becoming more apparent. The vastly different paths the two nations have taken regarding their indigenous populations. Australia's journey has been significantly more complicated than the bicultural integration seen across the Tasman. While there is profound respect for the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, the struggle for constitutional recognition has been fraught with difficulty. This was most recently seen in the 2023 Voice to Parliament referendum, which sought to enshrine an Indigenous advisory body in the Constitution. The proposal was overwhelmingly rejected by the Australian public, a result that many New Zealanders found astonishing. To a Kiwi, the idea of an Indigenous voice in government seems like a modest, common-sense step that aligns with their own long-standing political structures. This difference was poignantly captured in an art exhibition in Auckland, where the work of Aboriginal artist Vernon Key was displayed. His series, titled If I Was White, explored the feeling of being a stranger in one's own land, with lines like, "If I was white, I would not have to live in a country that hates me." For New Zealanders visiting the gallery, these statements were a jarring reminder of the resistance and colonization that still feels very raw in Australia. It reinforces a certain New Zealand sense of moral superiority, the idea that they are the forward-thinking sibling who has figured out how to reconcile with the past, while the big sibling across the ditch is still struggling to acknowledge the trauma of its own history. But Australians often view this New Zealand attitude as sanctimonious. They point out that Australia is a much larger, more complex federation with hundreds of distinct Indigenous groups, making a unified biculturalism much harder to achieve. There is also a sense that New Zealanders are quick to criticize Australia's record while ignoring their own ongoing struggles with Maori inequality in health, housing, and incarceration. It's the classic sibling dynamic. The little one points out the big one's flaws to feel better about their own smaller-scale problems. This principled stance of New Zealand also extends into the realm of foreign policy, particularly concerning China. In early 2021, New Zealand's Trade Minister, Damien O'Connor, made headlines when he suggested that Australia should show more respect and use a little more diplomacy in its dealings with Beijing. At the time, Australia was in the middle of a brutal trade war with China, having been hit with massive tariffs after calling for an inquiry into the origins of the pandemic. O'Connor's comments were seen by many Australians as a stab in the back, a junior partner siding with a global rival to score points. The Australian reaction was swift and cold. Politicians and commentators suggested that New Zealand was being naive, or worse, that it was willing to trade its values for a better trade deal. This highlighted a fundamental difference in their strategic cultures. Australia, viewing itself as a middle power, believes in standing firm and using its alliance with the United States as a shield. New Zealand, viewing itself as a small state, believes in the power of quiet diplomacy and maintaining a degree of independence that allows it to act as a mediator. New Zealand's Foreign Minister, Nanaia Mahuta, even offered that New Zealand could help mediate between Australia and China, an offer that was politely but firmly rebuffed by Canberra. To Australia, New Zealand's advice felt like a little sibling telling the big one how to handle a bully, while the little one is safely standing behind the big one's back. This independent streak has allowed New Zealand to bring biculturalism into their diplomacy in a way that Australia is still struggling to emulate. When Minister Mahuta speaks to the International Diplomatic Corps, she draws on Maori concepts of co-partnering and guardianship, linking them to global issues like climate change. It is a unique, influential voice that gives New Zealand a level of international soft power that often exceeds its actual military or economic weight. In fact, New Zealand recently received its best-ever placing in a global soft power index, partly due to the Jacinda factor and its handling of the pandemic. For Australians, this soft power can be frustrating. They see New Zealand getting all the international praise for its progressive values, while Australia does the heavy lifting in regional security and defense. There is a persistent feeling in Canberra that New Zealand is freeloading on Australia's defense budget, enjoying the safety of a stable region while taking a moral high ground that is only possible because Australia is willing to do the dirty work of power politics. It's a tension that surfaced during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where Australia went in with the U.S. and New Zealand stayed out, arguing for UN authorization. While they eventually both ended up in Iraq for reconstruction and training, the initial divergence was a stark reminder that they are, in fact, two different countries with two different views of the world. Even their views on the Pacific Islands reveal this competitive edge. Both nations view the Pacific as their backyard, but they have different styles of engagement. New Zealand, with its massive Pacifica population and deep cultural ties, often views itself as part of the Pacific family. Its approach is often seen as more culturally sensitive and community-focused. Australia, with its much larger aid budget and strategic interests, is often seen as the regional policeman. While both nations are committed to supporting Pacific priorities and fighting climate change, they are also quietly competing for influence, especially as China's presence in the region grows. Despite these growing pains, the relationship remains incredibly integrated at a level that most citizens don't even realize. If you buy a bike helmet in Sydney or Auckland, the sticker inside will likely say Australia-New Zealand Safety Standard. There are hundreds of these shared standards and integrated governance agreements that keep the two economies humming along as a single economic market. Their defense forces are more interoperable than almost any other two nations on Earth, sharing training, equipment, and intelligence. They are the only two countries that can have a shouting match over sporting results or culinary origins, and then go back to working in lockstep on a regional security issue the next day. As the two nations navigate the complexities of the 21st century, the little sibling syndrome continues to evolve. New Zealand is no longer just a quiet backyard for Australia. It is a confident, independent actor that is willing to challenge its big neighbor on everything from human rights to trade diplomacy. And Australia, while still the regional powerhouse, is starting to realize that it can learn something from New Zealand's success in building social trust and a unified national identity. The 2023 citizenship deal is a sign that the big sibling is finally starting to take the little one's grievances seriously, recognizing that a corrosive relationship isn't in anyone's interest. The Trans-Tasman Roadmap to 2035, agreed upon by both governments, aims to lift their shared ambition even higher, focusing on sustainable economies and a unified approach to the Pacific. It is a recognition that in an increasingly uncertain and dangerous world, they are each other's most natural and reliable allies. They may have different indigenous paths, different foreign policy techniques, and a long list of sporting and culinary scars, but they are still mates in the truest sense of the word.
But as they look toward 2035 and beyond, the question remains, can the sibling bond survive as their strategic interests continue to diverge? If Australia continues to prioritize a security-first alliance with the US and the UK through frameworks like AUKUS, and New Zealand continues to prioritize a principled and independent Pacific-focused diplomacy, will the gap between them eventually become too wide for even the South Pacific Voltron to bridge? Or will the sheer weight of their shared history, their integrated economies, and their millions of family ties ensure that they always remain, as one Australian Prime Minister put it, not just neighbors, but mates? The future of the Pacific may well depend on whether these two siblings can keep their bickering to the cricket pitch while standing together on the world stage. Ultimately, the relationship between Australians and New Zealanders is a complex tapestry of shared blood, fierce rivalry, and a toasty mutual affection. From the trenches of Gallipoli to heated debates over the Pavlova, these two nations have spent over a century defining themselves through and against each other. While political asymmetries and linguistic quirks highlight their differences, their deep economic integration and the South Pacific Voltron effect prove they are inseparable. As the geopolitical tides of the Pacific shift, their bond remains a rare constant in an uncertain world. They are more than just neighbors. They are siblings who know exactly how to annoy each other, yet would be the first to stand together against any outsider. Whether their unique brand of mateship can bridge a growing strategic divide remains the ultimate test for the decades ahead. Thank you for listening.